University and faculty associate at Princeton's Industrial Relations section. She is co-director of the development of the American Economy program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Professor Boustan was named an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow, a research fellow at the Strauss Institute at the NYU School of Law, and was awarded the Young Labor Economist Award from the IZA Institute of Labor Economics. Her recent work has been on the mass migration from Europe to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her 2016 book, Competition in the Promised Land, Black Migrants in Northern Cities and Labor Markets, examines the effect of the Great Black Migration from the rural South during and after World War II. It was a co-winner of the 2018 Alan Sharlin Memorial Award from the Social Science History Association. Today, she will be presenting on linguistic assimilation in the age of mass migration, evidence from Ellis Island oral histories. Everyone please unmute and join me in welcoming Professor Boustan.
To say you're speaking at the home of Alan Sharlin.
Yeah, so I'm just delighted to be invited to present here, particularly to present this brand new and highly interdisciplinary work. This is the first time that I've talked about this work with anyone outside our co-author team. And so your comments are going to be incredibly valuable for us. This paper is joint with my longtime collaborator who's here today, Ron Abramitsky from Stanford. And Ron and I are both economists, but we are also working with Peter Catron, who's here as well, a sociologist at UW, Dylan Connor, who's here, who's a geographer at ASU, and Rob Voigt, a linguist at Northwestern. So we think that our paper is the start of that classic joke that we all know. What happens when two economists, a sociologist, a geographer, and a linguist all walk into a bar. So we thought this would be a perfect paper for a demography group. And as Casey mentioned, the title is Linguistic Assimilation in the Age of Mass Migration. We are going to be marshaling new evidence on how immigrants assimilate into US society using evidence from oral histories that were collected by the Ellis Island Foundation. These histories were collected in the 1970s and 80s in anticipation of opening.
Leah, we just lost you for a moment.
Yeah, I can't hear you either.
Okay, we'll get Leah back in a second. We should all wave at her. Maybe, can she see us? This reminds me of my kids. Oh, we can't hear you.
Still can't hear you. Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful, thank you. So we lost you very early on. We heard 1970s and then we lost you.
All right, very good. These oral histories were collected in the 1970s and 80s in anticipation of opening up the Ellis Island Museum, which opened in 1990. And so these are retrospective histories of a lifetime that was spent primarily first in Europe and then in the United States after transit. So each one of these interviews has a transcript and an audio file that records around an hour of immigrant speech. And we're going to use that information to collect much more detailed measures of linguistic assimilation beyond what has been done in literature so far. So we're focused today on both the causes of linguistic assimilation. So what attributes of immigrants are associated with better linguistic ability at the end of life, as well as the consequences of developing fluency in English. So what are the payoffs in the labor market, for example, for being fluent in English? This is a component of immigrant assimilation, but it's only one component. Of course, other behaviors such as adopting American foods or style of dress or holidays are other features of cultural assimilation. However, learning English is regularly considered one of the most important aspects of immigrant assimilation. In the Gallup poll, 72% of Americans say that learning English is essential for immigrants. And in a range of studies over many contexts, it's typically found that immigrants who speak English very well report 10 to 30% higher wages. We're going to add to this literature by bringing to bear far more detailed information about English ability. What we know so far typically comes from a census question that asks immigrants, do they speak English not at all, well, very well, or fluent? So there's 4 elements on the scale. With an hour of recorded speech, we're able to code information from the linguistics discipline pertaining to depth of vocabulary, complexity of syntax, as well as accent and comprehensibility of immigrant speech. In addition, we can think of the transcript as information and data beyond just words and utterances in English. So we read each of the transcripts and code information on life in Europe pre-migration. And this is a very unique feature of the data set. Few data sources even today have information for immigrants from before arrival in the US. For immigrants in our sample, this will be circa 1910, primarily in Europe. And we can collect information on father's occupation, urban status, and so on. The final thing we can do with our data, because we have the names and dates of birth and countries of birth of the immigrants in our sample, is that we can match as many of them as possible to the US Census. And so we have a middle of life measure in 1940 for immigrants in our data in terms of years of education attained, occupation, and income in mid-career. And by putting together this new data, we come up with 2 new findings. The first is that linguistic ability, measured in a much more detailed way, is associated with earnings for immigrants who arrived in the country as adults. To give you an example, a 1 standard deviation increase in the depth of vocabulary is associated with a 20% gain in earnings. And so here we're able to add much more nuance to what others have found with a much more simplified or coarse scale. The second finding is that migrants who report being pushed from Europe due to flight from persecution or fleeing from war or violence, for example, achieved greater linguistic assimilation in the past. And this is true even controlling for country of origin, religion, and so on. Quite in contrast to what we find with a supplementary data set we put together for migrants today, in modern case, refugees achieve much less linguistic assimilation than migrants who report arriving to the US for economic reasons. At first, this was quite surprising to us, but we then learned that it's consistent with models of refugees and human capital acquisition. When migrants are arriving in a new destination, they're trying to decide, how much should I invest in skills in my new destination? If there's a high chance of returning home, which there was in the past and there is as well today, in both cases around a 30% return rate, that reduces the incentive to invest in the destination country skills. But what we find in the past is that migrants who report being pushed from Europe likely invested more and therefore achieved more linguistic assimilation because they did not anticipate going home, and so the return to investing in US-specific skills was higher. Before I start, I just want to set the scene for where most of this data will be coming from. I think you can probably see my mouse if I circle here. Most of what we're going to be talking about today is about migrants who arrived in the US during the age of mass migration, which was a period from 1850 to around 1920, during which time 15% of the US population was foreign born. And this is just graphing out from the census and then at the end from the ACS, the share of the population that reports being born in a foreign country. In the middle of the 1920s, the US border is substantially restricted by a set of restrictive immigration quotas. And so you see the share of population that's foreign-born declining until its low point in 1970, whereafter it rises again. So the migrants that we'll be talking about primarily in our Ellis Island sample are arriving in the US in 1900 to 1930, roughly. And so they come from primarily these two sending regions. The orange region here is Northern and Western Europe, countries like Germany and Ireland, and the pink region here from Southern and Eastern Europe. And you'll see that our sample is roughly evenly split between those two regions. Our modern data, of course, will come from a very different set of sending countries, in our case, primarily from Asia, nationwide, of course, also from Latin America as well. So we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the data because this data is new in terms of analysis for quantitative social science. So what can we pull out of the oral histories, details on our linguistic measures, and then we'll talk about the two results. Are the detailed measures of linguistic ability associated with socioeconomic status and moving up the economic ladder in the middle of life? And then what pre-migration factors are associated with linguistic assimilation? And then I'll end with a few notes on the modern oral history sample for comparison. Now may be a good time to stop and ask any kind of questions on the big picture before we get into some of the details on the data.
So maybe I can start with asking about age at migration.
Age at migration is, age at arrival is a crucial part of the patterns that you'll see. Many of our linguistic measures are highly associated with your age at arrival, with those who arrive younger, achieving much more linguistic fluency by the end of life. And so when we do some of our analysis in terms of income, for example, we're always going to split the sample into migrants who arrived as kids and migrants who arrived as adults. I just stripped that out of my intro slide just for sake of simplicity, but you'll see that as we go. Migrants who arrived as kids look much more like the native born and not as much like immigrants who arrived as teens or early adulthood. So why don't we get into that when we see.
We had a question from, another question just about the context of the interviews. Are we going to get to hear, by the way, are you going to play some audio?
I wish that I could. And the reason why I can't is because the website is currently down for maintenance. And I believe that they're actually in the process of adding there's around 400 missing transcripts from our current sample. And I believe they're uploading those, and then COVID kind of got in the way. And so we were dumb and we did not actually save any of the audio. We just were using the audio from the Ellis Island website. And so we don't have the files right now.
Okay, so this interruption did exactly what it's supposed to do. It got you engaged, and it also spurring a whole bunch of questions, which I'm not going to ask at all, but we'll get to later.
Great. Okay, so let me get into, I'm going to have a section on the data, and then we'll stop and ask some of those questions. Exactly. I think it's just a bit boring to listen to me go on and on. Okay, so this is what the Ellis Island website used to look like up till a few months ago when it closed for maintenance. So you can go to the Foundation website and it says explore our expanding collection of oral histories. Click here and you would see a set of names with an audio file and a transcript. We're able to use 1,200 complete interviews. And as I mentioned, we're going to do these three things: read them and code them as a data set, primarily focusing on information on the home country, so religion, country of birth, urban status and childhood, stated reason for the family migration or the individual migration, and father's occupation in childhood. Then we're going to consider the oral history as just a set of utterances, of speech utterances and code for linguistic ability using a variety of measures that come out of linguistics in terms of second language acquisition. The caveat here is that this is language that was produced when the immigrant was around 75 years old. So it's end of life linguistic fluency. And then we'll match to the census and we'll look at kind of middle of life, income, occupation, and education. And for that, we have around half of our sample, a bit more, that we're able to analyze that we actually can match to the census. Just a lot of detail on how we lose cases. Most of this comes from the fact that there's missing audio and transcript on the website for around 500 people, and hopefully we'll be able to get those back, as well as some interviews with border agents and so on. Now, here's some features of our sample. In some ways, our sample is quite quite broad in range. And in other ways, it's specific. In particular, in order to get into our interview sample, you have to survive until 1975 or 1980. And these are migration events that took place roughly in the 1920s. So either these migrants arrived relatively late in the open migration period, or after the border closed, or they arrived as a very young child. Those are the main ways that you can survive and make it to the interview sample. So you will see that, for example, in terms of arrival period, we do have coverage from the open migration period, as well as the period as there's discussion of border closure. But we also have a third of our sample arriving after the border closes. And when I say border closes, that's a bit of a shorthand. There were immigration quotas and they were restrictive, but there certainly was some entry that was allowed thereafter. So that's not going to be representative of all migrants from the age of mass migration. In terms of country coverage, though, we have migrants from Germany, Britain, Ireland, Italy, Russia, and the rest of Europe. So we have quite good country coverage. As well for father's occupation, probably selecting a bit more on the white collar side. 20% of our sample had a father who reported a white collar occupation in Europe. And this is something we gleaned from discussion. It wasn't a drop-down menu of choices. But we code the occupation as best we can. We also have coverage from blue collar, farmer, and laborer fathers. And then, as I mentioned, you're more likely to get into the sample if you arrived as a child. And we're doing the cutoff here as arrived before age 12, and results are not sensitive to using alternative cutoffs. With this detailed speech, we're able to put together better measures of linguistic ability than the simple 4-point scale that we have on the census, which of course is very coarse and also suffers from a pretty well-known bias. Kevin Lang in economics has written about this, that immigrants will benchmark their language ability and that reference point will change as they spend more time in the country. So first year in the US, if they can have a simple conversation, they're like, yeah, I speak English well or very well, certainly better than I expected. 10 years later, their expectations for themselves have increased. And so here we have more objective measures of linguistic ability. We're going to, like I mentioned, look at 3 different types of dimensions of linguistic assimilation: lexical or vocabulary, syntax or sort of sentence structure and complexity, and then accent. We're going to have specific measures from each of these 3 buckets. And then we also have composite indices where we include all of the kind of favorite measures from the linguistics discipline. Let me give you a little bit on each one of these. But I can certainly pause here if you have questions about, we're kind of starting to dive into the linguistic components. So if there are questions about the Ellis Island data, we can pause here for a bit. I see guys stuck off.
Yeah, hi there, Leah.
Hey.
Thank you. Hi. I'm just wondering, do you hear the interviewer ask questions? And so do you know anything about the interviewer? And could you then, you could tell if they were themselves potentially immigrants and had an accent and whether that might have affected their speech?
Yes, we do. And in terms of coding for accent, for example, we're very careful to strip out the interviewer questions so that our coders hear only the interviewee. But we also could do the opposite. We could have the coders code the interviewer because it could be that you're more forthcoming if there's a interviewer from your own home community, and that's something we can do. We also, of course, we see the transcript of the interview questions. The questions did follow a rough order, but they're not the same for each person, so it wasn't like a very strict interview schedule.
This is Don. You mentioned earlier that a caveat was that these people were interviewed at about age 75, and that could affect the linguistic measures. Could you tell us how? Do people lose ability in a second language, or how does that work?
I actually don't know. And that's something that Rob would probably know. I've sort of wondered that myself as a nascent thought, like what my concern about the age 75 issue is a bit different. If we're trying to say that linguistic ability generates income, we would like to have linguistic ability measured at the time that the income is earned. We don't. Instead, we have linguistic ability at the end of life. So it could be reverse causality, that if you're in a high status job and earning a lot of income, that puts you in touch with people who speak very well, and then you learn from them on the job. So it makes it harder for us to have strong associations or any kind of causal statements when we're associating end of life linguistic fluency with income in the middle of life. That was my concern, but I think your point. I've wondered about that. I don't have the answer, and I'll ask Rob. Okay, Josh, should we move on?
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yes, we're at 12:30, so we probably want to get to the results in about the next 15 or so minutes. Perfect. So that we can have the discussion based on the results.
Okay, great. So I'm going to give you an example of vocabulary measure to begin with. Our preferred measure here is called age of acquisition. And this is how it works. Every word in the English language is assigned the average age at which the usage of that word is typically acquired. So simple words like my and mine are acquired at age 2. Or if you have kids, you might know maybe at age 1. If you're kind of fighting with your sibling, you're like, mine. That's probably the first thing you learn how to say. Brother and sister at age 3, and so on. And this was developed from countless hours of observation of children's speech in language labs. And so let me give you an example of, in lieu of having actual audio, 2 migrants who we code as being push migrants, but they have different age of acquisition scores. So this Paul Deutsch, his score is 4.9, which is a little bit below average for our sample. And this is coded in a very sort of sensible way. If your score is 4.9, it means that the average word that you speak was acquired by someone around age 5. Maury Helsner is above average, and he's sort of at least a standard deviation above our mean with an AOA of 6. So AOAs tend to be pretty low because we say a lot of words like the and of, and each one of those count. Okay, so Paul Deutsch says, in explaining why his family left Russia, he says, I'll tell you why. My father went away from the army, blah, blah. And then after 2 years more, he took my mother and 3 boys up, you understand. So that's an example of someone who's kind of a little bit below average. Maury Helsner is above average, and he says the revolution was brewing, things were becoming very hectic, they were in a state of upheaval, it was considered a miracle to me that we left. So he has a lot of very advanced vocabulary in his speech. And so what we do is we just code each one of the words and we take the average for the individual. Now, of course, native speakers also have an AOA score. This is not only something for immigrants. So just to give you a sense, our sample has a mean of 5.2. And running out of power, hold on. Okay. And we coded the presidential debate of 2016, and you see that Trump had an AOA of 5.9 and Hillary of 6.6. So they're actually both over a standard deviation above our mean. But you also can see that there's a substantial gap between them of not quite a year in AOA for the vocabulary that they choose to use. Within our sample—
Which Wallace?
Oh, I think this was Chris Wallace as the host and moderator. So within our sample, here are 2 facts about the vocabulary score. First of all, men achieved more lexical complexity than women. So the blue dots are always above the red dots. And then the x-axis is age at arrival. So you can see that immigrants who arrived as kids did achieve a little bit more vocabulary depth than immigrants who arrived as teens or early 20s. So around an average of 5 versus an average of 4.8 or something like that. In terms of some bivariate associations, there's a number of things here that seem sensible to us in terms of pre-migration characteristics. Namely, if you were born in an urban area, your vocabulary is stronger. Germans, Jews, and those whose father were white collar. And so this might have something to do with the degree of educational access that you had as a child, values that your parents placed on education or language ability, and so on. But then we also see popping out here just from the bivariate association that push migrants also achieve more vocabulary depth. Now here it could just be that Jews are more likely to report fleeing from persecution. So of course we want to go into more detail on this as we go.
We have a question. What is the average score for native speakers?
Well, I don't know because our sample here is immigrants only, but that's why we kind of wanted to give you a sense that, I mean, you probably have a sense of how Trump speaks and how Hillary speaks in the debates. And so there it ranges from around 6 to around 6.5. So I would guess that, it would be around in the mid 6s. So our sample is 5.2. Now for accent, we have each file coded by 4 separate RAs. They're all native speakers. It was based on short snippets, so they heard 60 seconds for each person, and they coded on a 9-point scale. I wish I had the audio for you, but what you can see here is a very strong association with age at arrival. And it maps very nicely to what linguists say, that basically once you get to around age 9 or 10, it becomes much more challenging to absorb new phonemes and be able to speak new sounds. And so there's not much of an association with age at arrival until age 10. And after that, a pretty linear association where your accent is stronger if you arrived later in life. There's also not much of a difference here between men and women. So you can see that vocabulary and accent seem to be quite different. Not surprisingly, because it's more challenging to actually absorb a new accent and new sounds, we don't see very much in the bivariate relationships here. There's not much that predicts high accent or low accent. I won't say much about syntax here because what we find for syntax is relatively similar to what we find for vocabulary. Our favorite single measure is mean length of sentence. So it's actually very easy to understand. The longer your sentence, the more complex your syntax, because you're going to have more joining words, and that's what we mean here by coordination. There'll be more subordinate clauses and so on. Now, I just want to point out in this correlation matrix that the linguistic measures are not that highly correlated with each other. So this is the vocabulary measure up here in the top row, and it's correlated -0.28 with accent and -0.43 with syntax. So there is a correlation there, but it's certainly not a perfect correlation. If you look at the other types of characteristics across the top row, the thing that really pops out as being very closely related to vocabulary is years of schooling. So we want to make sure that we're not just picking up education, and that's why it's quite nice that we can match to the census. So here, I won't say very much about census linking techniques at all. We typically use algorithmic methods where we match by computer, but that's because we typically have samples of many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands. Here we're trying to get a sample of 1,200 people. So we matched by hand. We thank Joe Price at BYU Family Lab for doing this for us, and we're able to match 56%. As is common with match samples, it's not fully representative of the universe that we're at risk of matching, and it tends to be related to country of origin, because the more various your names, like how many last names exist in that country, the easier it is to match people because you're more likely to get a unique name. So we match, for example, more Italians and fewer Germans. And probably as a result, we match more Catholics, for example. That's associated with being Italian, and so on. So there is some country of origin patterns in who we're able to match. Once we do get everyone into the census, we can see, for example, that the modal year of schooling in our data set is 8 years of schooling. We have representation in white collar, but also quite a number of blue collar workers. Okay, so that concludes the discussion of the data, and I will now show you results from our 2 findings. But if anyone has data questions now, we can talk, or we can
Just
plow
in the
ahead.
interest of time, let's go right to the results.
Okay, so let me start with the first finding, which is what is the association between our linguistic ability measures and income? And we want to take into account that this relationship might be moderated by education. So I'm going to start with just the bivariate relationship. And we thought it would be sort of simple and easy to see on a picture if we broke down our vocabulary measure into the share of words that you utter that are in one of 4 categories. Okay, so the omitted category is words that you might learn by age 3, and then we have words by age 5, by age 8, and then words that you learn after age 8. And we have 2 different graphs here. The left-hand side are the child immigrants, and the right-hand side are the adult immigrants arrived after age 12. Like I mentioned to Josh, we're always going to subdivide that way. And you see that the larger the share of your vocabulary that comes from these words that you learn from age 9 onward, the higher your income. There's not really very much in terms of words from age 3 versus 5 versus 6 or 7, but it's really about these kind of more complex words. If we instead look at the relationship between income and just average age of acquisition, we do find a strong relationship for both child immigrants and adult immigrants when we're looking bivariate. So now we want to see, is this really just coming from education? I mean, the more years you spend in school, the more vocabulary you learn.
Leah, could you use your mouse just when you talk about the coefficients? Could you point to the bar that we could follow
Sure.
you?
So I was focusing on this last bar here for the adult immigrants, where you see that the share of your vocabulary that comes from words that you learn after age 9 is positively associated with your income. And then I also wanted to make the point that if instead you look at averages, so just what's the average word in your vocabulary, you can see, for example, that if you regress log income on the average age of acquisition, you do find this strong positive relationship. And I'll interpret the magnitude in a second. But what I want to do on the next slide is say, well, we better control for education, because clearly when you're in school, you learn vocabulary. But we want to know whether linguistic assimilation is separate and above and beyond education. And so here, it's actually a pretty complicated slide with a lot of things going on. But we again have the child immigrants on the left and the adult immigrants on the right. And we start by putting everything into standardized units so that we can compare the return to a year of school, to some amount of schooling, to the return to some amount of vocabulary depth. So now everything is in standard deviation. We start with the boxed regressions are bivariate. So not surprisingly, if you just look at the relationship between income and education, income and vocabulary, those are strong and positive across the board. Okay, so education over here for child immigrants, vocabulary for child immigrants, and so on. This is education for adults and so on. Now, what happens if you include them both in the regression, or, you know, in addition, you add the remainder of the controls? So we get very different patterns then for child immigrants and adults. For child immigrants, we have a return to education that's really impervious to adding the other controls, and the vocabulary relationship disappears. For adult immigrants, we have that the return to education gets very small, and the vocabulary is what seems to matter. So the conclusion I had up here, for adult immigrants, it's the depth of your vocabulary that associated with higher income, and for child immigrants, it's the standard return to education. That's true if you look at income, and it's also true here if you look at occupation score instead, which is going to capture some folks who are self-employed, for example. Same pattern. We have a strong return to education for the child immigrants, not much in terms of vocabulary, and for the adult immigrants, we have the strong return to vocabulary and not much for the education that you earned abroad.
Just so we can, okay, that's what I wanted to ask. The adult immigrants, their education is by and large outside of the United States, and the child immigrants, their education is by and large in the United States, or is that the way to think about this?
We're cutting at, yes, because we're cutting at age 12, so arrived after age 12, and the modal years of schooling in the sample is 8 years, is 8th grade. So it's possible that some of these guys that we call adults, maybe they got an extra year or two in the US, but for the most part, we should think about this as education that you would have received in the home country. We don't know for sure and we can't separate it, but it looks like that education coefficient that we see for adults is really just picking up the association between education and linguistic ability. And it's linguistic ability that really matters for adult immigrants. Okay, so that's our first finding. I'm just going to skip over and just summarize, like I said, for immigrants who arrived as adults, there is a large return to linguistic assimilation, and that accounts for most of what we thought we observed and we called a return to education. And in contrast, for child immigrants, they look much more like the US born in the sense that they were educated almost completely in the US or entirely, and they achieve complete English fluency. And so in that case, we're really just capturing standard return to education for child immigrants. Okay, now my second finding is about which are the attributes of your pre-migration experience that are associated with improved linguistic fluency or linguistic assimilation. And what we find here is that push migrants or refugees achieved more linguistic assimilation in the past. Now, this is a variable that was coded by hand by undergraduate RAs, and so they have to make a lot of judgment calls here of who's a push migrant and who's a pull migrant. So I'm just breaking out a word cloud for these are the words that are most strongly associated with being coded as a push migrant in our data. These are not frequencies, these are log odds. Relative odds of being push versus pull are associated with these words. And you can see here a number of words that you would think are related to hardship at home. So concentration camp, revolution, war, prison, military, and also some words that are associated with being Jewish. So synagogue, kosher, etc. And so that suggests that it's important to control for religion when you're looking at push versus pull. And finally, some words that are related to kind of bureaucracy and hardship of getting into the US, border, quota, affidavit. When it comes to pull migrants, these are words that are either associated with industry and occupation, particularly farming. We have words like lamb and wheat, or cement, like some blue collar words, or with family networks. A lot of married, dad, mama, kids, etc. So it seems relatively clear from these word clouds that these two groups are distinct. Now, the final set of results are going to be similar to the bivariate relationships that I showed you. Our outcome is going to be age of acquisition, our vocabulary measure. But in this case, we're going to be putting in not just each one of these pre-migration attributes, but we're also going to be including controls. So the gray and the black bars reflect standard controls like age, country of birth, decade of arrival, and then the red and orange bars reflect including all of these pre-migration attributes together as part of the multivariate regression. And what we see is that even after controlling for things like father's occupation, religion, and so on, we still are finding that push migrants achieve more linguistic fluency by end of life. And these are our best controls for pre-migration selection. So you might think that if you're fleeing from hardship, that you're going to have a different selection of who comes to the US. Like maybe everyone's going to get up and go, and so it's going to be neutral selection. Relative to pull migrants who could be coming from the lower end of the occupational distribution. Now, we can't really nail this, but at least we have these father's occupation measures, and it looks like push migration is still relevant. We also were concerned in a kind of technical sense that maybe talking about persecution requires more complex vocabulary. So we redid the analysis with just the second half of the transcript where the immigrants are no longer talking about Europe. Now they're talking about their time in the US, and we see the same result. When it comes to accent, we do not see much of a relationship with push migrants and really with anything else. And so accent seems to be much more kind of deterministically related to when you arrived in the country. Did you arrive before or after this critical age that allowed you to absorb the relevant sounds? Okay, the final thing that I wanted.
Can I just ask one question? so you're controlling for where you're from, what your religion is. Can you give us a kind of, maybe it's for discussion, but just kind of a picture in our mind of who we're contrasting here? In other words, I guess it's two people from Italy, one who's a forced migrant and one who's a voluntary migrant.
Yeah.
Is that the kind of thought experiment we should be thinking when we're looking at this?
Exactly. There are certainly in the Jewish population going to be a lot of people who are moving to follow family, moving because they heard about a good economic opportunity, and then there's going to be others who report leaving because of a pogrom. They have to be arriving in the same decade from the same country of origin with the same religion, but yet they report two different reasons for the move. There also could be Irish migrants or Italian migrants who are leaving because of war or because of conscription into the military, because of religious persecution. And so we would be contrasting cases in that as well. And so we do see that the Jewish words do pop up on the push migrant word cloud. And so there certainly is an association there, but that's not the only group that's going to be identifying this.
Thanks.
Okay. The final few slides is a comparison to modern oral histories. And so far, we have only really located a few collections, so our sample is even smaller than before. So if you're saying, geez, can't believe we're here talking about 1,000 cases, well, now we're going to be talking about, around 150 cases. And our data comes from the Minnesota Historical Society. It was a snowball sample, and we are able to recreate the same linguistic and background measures that we see in the Ellis Island sample, but we do have the limitation here that the distribution of countries of origin in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area is not the same as nationwide. So we're very open to other ideas that you may have about modern oral histories, and we also recognize that immigrants today are still with us, and so we can also certainly try to do some of this ourselves. For the sample that we found, we have around a third of the sample who report being push migrants. Either they are officially considered refugees or asylees, or they report fleeing from persecution and getting into the US through other means. So that group is pretty large. But of course, the countries of origin in that group are going to be very different from the past. We have a number of migrants from Somalia, from Cambodia, and then a smattering of other countries. And what we find today in this small sample is that migrants who report leaving their country due to persecution have lower age of acquisition, have lower lexical composite, which combines age of acquisition with a few other things, lower acoustic composite, which means that they have more accented speech, and maybe slightly lower syntactic complexity as well. So across the board, push migrants today have lower linguistic ability in this particular sample. And so this is highly correlated with country of origin, and you can see some of the countries here: Cambodia, Myanmar, Somalia, versus pull countries like China, India, Korea, and Mexico. And usually in our sample—
Are the fixed effects for country of origin in these regressions? Or
No, because in this sample, we basically have either everyone's a pull migrant or everyone's a push migrant from these countries. We did not code the push versus pull using country of origin. We coded in the same way with undergrads reading the transcripts, but it seems like the stories that are being told from these parts of the world are just very different. In a few cases, we had one or two people that we coded differently, but we just didn't feel comfortable living off of that variation, and it's just not powered. And so we would like to be able to either focus in on a couple of communities where we think there's substantial, within community variation, so that we can strip out some of these country of origin effects, or find a substantially larger sample. But at the moment, this is what we have, and it's at least suggestive of a difference over time. So my conclusion is twofold. So on the one hand, we have the first result: linguistic assimilation in the past was associated with higher income for immigrants who arrived as adults during the age of mass migration. It's not simply an education effect. There seems to be an independent effect of depth of vocabulary, and I skipped over one slide to show as well an independent effect of accent. Second result is that in the past, migrants who report being pushed out of Europe due to persecution achieved more linguistic assimilation. And this is consistent with this literature on refugee human capital acquisition that I mentioned, with the idea that those who expect to stay in their destination permanently have a greater incentive to invest in destination country skills. But we do acknowledge that there's also possible neutral or positive self-selection going on, and we only have a limited set of background controls to address that. Intriguingly, refugees today do not achieve more linguistic assimilation, which may simply reflect changes in country of origin, or alternatively could be a real result about the modern refugee system, which requires documenting hardship, and so that may select for a different set of immigrants than in the past. None of the immigrants that we call push migrants went through a formal refugee or asylum process, and they simply report that their family left Europe for a set of reasons. And so there may be a different selection process going on today that could explain this change over time.
Terrific. Thank you, Leah. We're at 12:55, so we have officially 5 minutes of our official program, but usually we stay another 10 minutes till 1:10. So those of you, if anybody has to leave at 1 and has a question, please type that in the chat and I'll make sure to get your question in. Let me just begin by reaching back a little bit, and people were talking about family size, family context, and I'll add neighborhood context. You guys looked at this maybe in the 1940 census?
Okay, those are great ideas. From the Ellis Island, we have party size, so we know how many people you traveled with. So did you arrive as an individual or did you travel as a family? We can look at that. As well, from the 1940 census, you're right, we have very detailed geography as of 1940. We did try to code from Ellis Island, you know, first city or neighborhood, second city of neighborhood, and try to track moves over time. But some people were incredibly detailed on that, and they told us 6 different locations with high level of detail, and some people just didn't mention where they were living. So we were unable to put together something really systematic in a kind of longitudinal way, but we can at least get a snapshot on neighborhood from 1940.
Great. Let me ask a question I was thinking right at the end, which is that, you know, obviously there are a lot of differences between the contemporary situation and the past situation. What makes us think that these are not just different origins today? Why do we think it's
different countries of origin?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's explaining the difference. Why do we think that the effect of being a push migrant has changed rather than we just have a different set of origins?
Yeah, it could be. One feature of the past is that there was a lot of variety in why immigrants explain their reason for leaving, even within country of origin. And today that may not be as true. So we'll have to think, I mean, I think it might be true for Central America. It might be true for Mexico, depending on the, you know, the year of arrival and so on. So we might need to focus in on cases where we think there's actually within community variation, and then we will be able to get closer to what we're able to do for the past. So ideas on that front would be quite useful for us.
Great. So let me, I hope I'm not violating Claude Fisher's trust in testing me privately, but let me ask his question that he was chatting to me about, which is that these stories of what the reason for your migration are told in retrospect. And what you may be seeing here is some people tell the story about persecution, some people tell the story about economic opportunity, but really their situation viewed from outside may have been quite similar. What may be quite different is what story they choose to emphasize and tell. That seems plausible to me. Have you thought about that in terms of the people who choose to talk about hardship versus the people who choose to talk about, say, their family connections?
That's really fascinating. Thank you for raising that. That's something that Ron and I have been thinking about quite a bit as we're working on a book on some of our material, and just the interplay between the anecdotes and whether we're talking about push versus pull, or whether we're talking about the degree of success you achieve in the US and so on, how people tell their story, and then what we see from census data and so on can be quite different. And so we are sensitive to that. We haven't really worked on that in this project. And so the first thing that jumps to mind for me is that there certainly are known dates, whether we're talking about the Irish case or the Russian Jewish case, that are known for being dates of intense persecution. And so we could look at year of arrival and country of origin and religion, and between those three come up with a coding of people that we think are likely refugees, and see if those results look very different from what the kind of self-stated rationale for moving might be.
Can you say that last part again? I didn't quite follow.
So, you know, if there's known dates of persecution for, like, let's say, large pogroms, 1906, for example, in the Russian Empire. So if you're Jewish, born in Russia and arrived in the US in 1906, we could code you as a refugee, even if you yourself don't say so. You know, so we actually take what we think of as like slightly more objective dates of persecution by community and assign people to a refugee status, irrespective of what they said, and see if results look very different. If they do, it could be that those are just, you know, not a comprehensive list of all of the, you know, bad events that took place in Europe. But if, you know, so it would be hard to interpret if the results look quite different. But if they look similar, I think that that's a good sign that we are picking up something real in how people explain their personal circumstance.
Have you thought about somehow getting a proxy measure for how easy it was to go back? In other words, maybe someone who's in New York or Boston can go back easily, but someone who moves to Kansas City is not going to go back, so they may not be a push migrant, but they're more committed to staying. For some reason, they're going to stay no matter what. As using that kind of as, yeah, that's, I mean, really the motivation, right? It's not being a push migrant. It's rather, are you going to stay no matter what? How committed are you?
That's certainly the interpretation we've layered on it so far. So you're right. It would be nice to test that in other contexts. There might be other reasons why you're less likely to return, and we could try to explore those. I mean, if you arrive with a family versus arriving as a single male, then, for example, that might be something associated with a lower chance of return. So we could think about probability of return.
Great. Let's get me off. I'm going to mute and let people just try chiming in. We'll try Don Tryman's idea of just opening up just unmute and talk and interrupt each other and see if anybody joins in.
Yeah, we do have a few questions around sort of size of, who you immigrated with and the size of your family. As you mentioned, potentially that's a motivation for not returning, but are there other ways in which this variable might, sort of have an effect on sort of economic success and language acquisition?
Well, we'd have to, I think the idea of looking at 1940 neighborhood or even earlier neighborhoods, because we could match to earlier censuses too. We haven't done that, but we could match to 1920 or 1930. It might be that if you move alone, you're more likely to live in an enclave because you need to find someone from the home community to move in with as a border to get yourself started. And so party size may be related to your incentive to stay long term, but also maybe to where you end up kind of rooting yourself. And so we could look at that association.
Oops, this is Don. Leah, I have a comment about or question about your differences over time, your differences between Ellis Island and the Minnesota sample, leaving aside composition differences between the two groups. I wonder whether part of the outcome differences that you observe may have to do with, first, with job opportunities in the beginning of the 21st century versus the beginning of the 20th century. It may be much more difficult for push refugees to assimilate into the workforce in a successful way in the 21st century because of the different distribution of jobs. So I don't know how to test that, but that's my first observation. The second observation has to do with the possibility of group help agencies. One of the things about the Russian Jews or the Eastern European Jews, is that when they came, there were well-established German Jews who established help groups to help the Eastern European and Russian Jews get ahead. They disparaged them, you know, these low-rent people who we have to help, but they did help them. And the thing about the Minnesota sample is that they may not have been here long enough to establish those kinds of group help organizations. Again, I don't know how to test that difference, but I'm simply trying to suggest some historical context that may help you make sense out of the differences that you observe.
Great, thank you. I mean, that's really the newest part of our work, so we're intrigued by the finding and we'd like to push on it more. So those are all good ideas, thanks.
This is Josh. I think the last paper I saw you give at Berkeley was on the names given to children. I'm sure you guys have thought about this with your immigrants, people who decide to change their name or not. We had that initial discussion with Don before we started the session. Any thoughts on doing this at a larger population level, thinking about whether people decide to change their names or not, and whether that's a commitment to staying or anything like that?
Oh, you know, thanks. Like citing our other work as useful food for thought for us is very helpful. We have not thought about looking at the names at all. And in 1940, some of these folks are living in the household with their US born children. So we could look at the name choices that they make for their kids. And we also, we do have some scope for thinking about the name that they report in the 1940 census versus the name they report to the interviewer, though of course if that name changes drastically, we probably would count them as a non-match.
Great. Before we wrap up our session, I was wondering if you could just tell a little bit the origin story of this project. As economic historians, typically working with large data sets, quantitative data, what got you motivated to work on a small, super rich data set?
Well, so Peter and Dylan were students at UCLA when I was in the economics department there, and we worked closely together. And Rob is was a student at Stanford and had some connection with Ron. So this is a really nice project that comes out of really interdisciplinary connections that, yes, Ron and I are economists, but we're interacting with graduate students in a number of social science disciplines. I think that we got a little bit overexcited and thought that maybe with new machine learning techniques, we would be able to convert like all of the oral histories in the world into, you know, incredibly large data sets. And this is sort of, you can see as far as we have gotten, and we've realized that it's more challenging than that. And so we are scaling back from our grand plans to conquer the whole world.
But I like the ambition. I like the ambition. Okay, on that note, thank you so much. We can turn off our mutes and give applause for beautifully presented and super interesting work. If people want to stick around, we also have lots of co-authors here. I don't know if the co-authors want to offer corrections, objections, or whatever to what Leah has said, additions. Otherwise, I think, Maria, are you going to keep the session live for a couple more minutes? And if people have to leave, we totally understand.
Yes, so we had advertised until like 1:15, so we have like a good, 5-6 minutes more, if that works.
Yeah, let's maybe hear from the co-authors if we don't have more questions.
Dylan, Peter, any words of wisdom for us? I think Ron had to leave.
Lead us off, Peter, as the sociologist.
What's that? No, I think you did a good job, Leah. Congratulations on a good talk.
Yeah, we'll conquer our grand plans eventually.
So yeah, it's been really fun project. Any thoughts that people have now or later by email, please let us know.
Yeah, but I think the other thing that strikes me for the broader context is I think what you read about in the headlines is that immigrants aren't assimilating, and then the social science research tends to show that linguistic acquisition, at least, is better today on general, I think, for immigrants than it was 100 years ago. And so that seems like the other layer. It's more framing thing. I know you did a short talk, but that seems like a big motivation, is that we actually have this differentiated world. At least what you're finding now is that there's, even though maybe in general there's easier linguistic assimilation, that there's a difference in the people's agency, or I don't exactly know what the difference is caused by, but that seems like super interesting. Adds relevance to what you're talking about. Particularly, maybe we're not doing so well with our immigrant, refugee resettlement. I mean, it's the other, of course, more political side to it.
Well, I do think it's a nice opportunity where we have some push and some pull migrants from the same community, you know, who arrived at the same time, same religion, same country of origin. And that's much harder to get today. Maybe we need to pursue the Central American route or something. But in that sense, I do think that the results we're showing you for the modern data could be completely wrong. It could be that if we find a case where we have the ability to look at push versus pull within the same country of origin, we might recover the same results that we're finding for the past. So that was intended, you know, to be taken at the moment with a big grain of salt. I worry, like you say, because of the potential political ramifications, I worry about even kind of rolling that out, and if we're not able to, you know, at least control for country of origin, so that we're comparing two people from the same country.
Super. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to meet with Leah tomorrow with another faculty member. So kind of our faculty lunch. What time are we doing that? Can you remind me, Leah?
I think it's 1:30 Eastern. Okay,
so 10:30 here. If you're interested in joining, shoot me an email and we'll get you connected to the call for further discussions on this and other topics. And let me just do a publicity for Leah and Ron. They've just released, along with their colleagues, a new set of public record linkage IDs for connecting all of the historical censuses from 1940 back to, how far back does it go?
To 1850.
To 1850. And so that's a big project that has just been released, and that is really exciting. And they even have some YouTube videos. I think I saw one on Twitter.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. So this is all with the algorithmic links, but we do look at a variety of different algorithms, so you can kind of pick your favorite, and we'll be incorporating more as time goes on. Both some work that we're doing, like Myra is helping with, and then other people are kind of sending us stuff as well. So hopefully you don't have to link anymore yourself. You know, hopefully you can download the links and then use the historical IDs to merge in with the IPM's complete count data that's posted publicly. And then you can go do projects that involve, you know, historical panel data. So definitely spread the word on that, because I do think a lot of graduate students are interested in matching projects, but just the matching technology can be an impediment, and getting access to the data can be an impediment. So I hope people use it and like it. Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you all. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.